Thank you, Dave. You know, it's a pleasure to be back here. It's been a long time since I've been to an EBBA meeting. I'm an EBBA Life member, but like Dave said, for the better part of 15 years, the EBBA meeting always coincided with the time that I would be down at Fort Morgan in Alabama with Bob Sargent's group, the Hummingbird Study Group. And as most of you know, Bob passed away about 1.5 years ago, and HBSG is no more. So the one bright spot, the one silver lining in that loss is that I'm now free to come to EBBA meetings again. So you're going to have to change the locks if you want to keep me away. So what I'd like to do tonight is, and by the way, I'll apologize, we're recording this thing, and we're doing it on my Mac, and which is different than the PCs. And so that stupid thing in the upper left corner that I've now drawn your attention to, you're not going to be able to take your eyes off it. We can't figure out how to get rid of it. It's there, deal with it. But anyway, my wife hates the title for this presentation. She says, that's the least, that's just such an unserious title. I'm not a serious person. And you know, what I've been doing for the better part of 30-some years is messing around with birds. I've been messing around with birds for, maybe not quite 57 years, but pretty much close to it. I've been fascinated by birds, like most of you have been, my entire life, and I have always been looking for some way to get closer to birds. I grew up real close to Hawk Mountain. Started going to Hawk Mountain when I was 12, and for that first part of my life, when I was a teenager and through my early 20s, just sitting on a mountaintop watching those birds go past was mesmerizing enough. You know, merlins and sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks and golden eagles and goshawks late in the year. That was addictive enough. But then in the mid-'80s, I encountered the avian equivalent of crack cocaine, which was banding hawks, and it was all this guy's fault. Jim Bednarz, who was the first research director at Hawk Mountain, and I wheedled my way into the blind in 1987 in order to do a story for our local newspaper. I was still doing some reporting at the time. And Jim put me off as long as possible, because the last thing he wanted was a reporter in the blind. And so finally, I'm in the station one day, and it was dead. No wind, no hawks, no nothing. Jim figures, perfect, I'll get rid of this reporter. He sends the interns home with the truck, and he says, well, we'll just sit here and talk. And as soon as the interns left, the wind started blowing. And the birds started moving, and a red tail comes down the ridge into the trap. Jim catches it, and he goes, damn, now what? Okay, you sit there, pull these strings. When the hawk comes in there, pull this trigger. And about 15 minutes later, I caught my first red-tailed hawk. And I thought, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Those of you who've trapped raptors know what I'm talking about. I've been a fly fisherman since I was a little kid. And this whole notion of fly fishing in the sky for raptors, luring a goshawk or a Cooper's hawk or golden eagle down, that atavistic thrill that you get when that bird is locked on the lure and you're right on the other side of that lure and it looks like that eagle is locked up on you. You feel the hairs on the back of your neck come up. That is just the coolest thing in the world. Admittedly, there's a lot of science here, and it's not just something you do for fun, but I've got to tell you that was the most instantly addictive thing I've ever experienced. Now, it was also something that brought me in contact with a lot of really amazing people. Jim Bednarz was a great example in the years that he was at Hawk Mountain, and since then he's gone on to do a lot of other great things. Ernesto Ruelas, many of you know Ernesto, is the founder of the Veracruz Raptor Project in Mexico. He was an intern at Hawk Mountain in 1990, spinning these ridiculous stories about this massive hawk migration through the mountains of eastern Mexico, and we were like, we had just fall off the turnip truck yesterday. And then in 1992, I went down for 6 weeks to help Ernesto and realized he wasn't blowing smoke. It's the world's greatest raptor migration going through that area of eastern Mexico. Mark Vicasi, who was a research tech at Hawk Mountain and around the same time, went on to lead the Vermilion Cliffs condor restoration program for the Peregrine Fund in Arizona when they first brought condors back to the Four Corners area. My wife, I would not be married today were it not for a goshawk. Our second date was, you think I'm kidding? I have no illusions. I mean, come on. Our second date was to the banding station in early October, and she said, I'd really like to see a goshawk. And I'm like, well, it's kind of early in the season. She said, I'd really like to to see a goshawk. And I caught her Cooper's hawks, and I caught her Sharpshin hawks, and I caught her this red tail. And she seems happy with the red tail. And as we were packing up to go, because it's a long hike down the mountain, she had to drive all the way back to Maryland, where she worked for National Audubon Society. She said, I'd really like to see a goshawk. And I said, okay, here comes one. And the earliest goshawk, bar 2, that I'd ever caught came down the ridge into the trap. I looked like the banding god. I would be a lonely single man for that goshawk. I actually don't do that much diurnal raptor banding these days. Occasionally I get an opportunity, like I did with Bill Clark a few years ago down in the lower Rio Grande Valley, catching Swainson's hawks. But you know, over the years that I started big, you know, I started with red tails and eagles, and I've been working my way further and further down. One of the luckiest things that ever happened to me, and I mean this seriously, I mean, next to meeting my wife, probably the luckiest thing that's ever happened to me was meeting Bob Sargent and his crew down in Alabama, the Harvard study group. It was like getting love bombed by a cult. I mean, I just have never felt such a sense of community and family as I did with those folks. And I'd done a little bit of passerine banding up to that point, but this was an opportunity to really immerse myself in passerine banding and to go, you know, regular as clockwork every year, late March and April, down to the Gulf Coast of Alabama and meet those neotrops coming across the Gulf after I'm sick to death of chickadees and juncos up here in the monochrome woods of the mid-Atlantic. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful to Bob and everybody else in that group for giving me that opportunity. They're also the folks that taught me to band hummingbirds, which is something else. But I just wanted to divert. So, you know, I started big, worked my way down to passerines. One of the coolest things I'm involved with right now is a passerine project that we started last year in Denali National Park up in Alaska, something called Critical Connections Project. And it's a collaboration between the National Park Service and Alaska Geographic and the Denali Education Center and the Biodiversity Research Institute up in Maine. And what we're doing is trying to plot the migratory connectivity of the birds that breed in central Alaska and fan out over 3/4 of the Earth's surface every year to many of the places where the visitors to the park are coming from. And we're doing this for a couple of reasons. First of all, the 54 million acres of national parkland in Alaska, most of the emphasis there is on megafauna mammals, charismatic giant mammals that will eat you, grizzly bears and wolves and things like that. And yet, the bird life in Alaska, as most of you are aware, is incredible, and we know relatively little about it. So last year, we started a project that it's going to go as long as we can find funding and keep our feet above ground. We deployed geolocators last year on gray-cheeked thrushes and on Swainson's thrushes. And we're going to go back again in about a month and a half and start recapturing those birds. And then we have a whole new sweep of birds that we're going to be tagging this coming year. And we're really focusing particularly on birds in Denali that breed in willow thickets and young spruce forests, because I've been visiting Denali regularly for more than 30 years. And a place like this is a view near a place called Primrose Ridge. 30 years ago, you couldn't see a shrub or a tree from that vantage point. It was just all open tundra. With climate change, we're seeing dramatic changes in the landscape, and for some of these birds, this is the land of milk and honey now. And so populations of many of these birds are rising. So, you know, last year we had a field team of about 8 people, and we were National Park Service, really 5-star, maybe not quite 5-star accommodations, but nevertheless, you know, we had a little assembly line assembling our geolocators. We're using Henry Strubby's leg loop method, which is slick as ice once you know how to put them on. And this was where we were working. Now the downside to this, before you get all doughy-eyed over this, was we were getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning every day to go to work, but it never gets dark, so it doesn't really feel like 2 o'clock in the morning. Get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, in the field by 3, driving into the park, usually at our study site by 4 o'clock in the morning, set up mist nets, set up our audio lures. We had little beautiful decoys that one of my owl banding volunteers back in Pennsylvania made for us. Turn on the audio lure, let it start working its magic on these birds, and lie down and take a breath. We have Dr. Ian Stenhouse there on the right from BRI. Ian has the most interesting accent of anybody I know. Some of you I know Ian. He's a Scotsman who now lives in Maine and had lived for a while in Newfoundland, so it has just done terrible things to his dialect. David Tomeo from Alaska Geographic and Laura Phillips from Denali National Park. It's a very peaceful place. This is not something you can usually do in the East. Just find some spongy tundra to lie down on and rest after several hours of hard work. This is also the picture that was taken just before all hell broke loose, because the other thing you don't have to worry about in the East are these. And I had just gone down to check the nets when simultaneously I heard them start screaming, yelling, "Hey bear, hey bear, hey bear," and waving their arms, and this roaring sound, and what sounded like somebody pounding 2x4s together, which was the grizzly bear female with a cub that was charging in and clashing her teeth together. It's amazing. None of us soiled our pants. And in fact, the bears, which then turned from Ian, and literally, she charged within several feet of him, changed her mind at the last second, ran down the hill to where I was, went past me in the willows just a few feet away with her cub right through the middle of our net array, did not touch a net, and actually flushed 3 gray cheeks into the net. So I would recommend that you use grizzly bears as meat. So, typical process, we're getting some morphometrics on these birds, putting the geolocators on. Once we knew what we were doing with this spread, and those of you who are working with geolocators and nanotags, man, this was just, like I said, slick as ice. It takes about 30 seconds to put one of these things on. They ride really, really beautifully. I leave it to you to figure out which one is the real one. So the plan for this Critical Connections project is every year we're going to shift into a different suite of birds. So last year we were focusing just on gray-cheeked and Swainson's thrushes. This year we'll be tagging additional gray-cheeks and Swainsons, as well as an equal cohort of hermit thrushes. And we're also going to be tagging blackpoll warblers, Arctic warblers, Wilson's warblers, and probably fox sparrows. And we're actually bulking up the number of blackpolls we're going to be tagging, because Stu and some of his colleagues are going to be working on a blackpoll project across Canada and up into Alaska, so we can bolster that. And we're going to be trying to retrap the thrushes that we released last year. And we're going to be moving eventually into raptors, into other passerines, into alpine nesting seabirds and shorebirds. We're just, like I said, we're going to do this until somebody puts us in the ground. I'm particularly excited about working with the Arctic warblers, because this is a species, the only band returns for Arctic warblers are a handful from the breeding grounds, generally within the same breeding season. There are no band returns from its wintering grounds, which, so far as we know, is in Indonesia, the Philippines, Borneo. But what had been this huge species with a number of subspecies across Eurasia and Alaska has been split in the last couple of years. And I can't even find any records of the subspecies that is now the Arctic warbler from Alaska that's been recorded as a specimen on the wintering grounds. So we actually don't. I think we don't know where this bird goes for the winter. So the geolocator data should help us with that. Mostly, I'm just happy that it gives me an excuse to continue to go back to Alaska every year, even if it does mean getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and getting charged by grizzly bears. But what I want to talk about mostly tonight are 2 groups of birds that I've worked with most closely over the last few years, hummingbirds and owls. And I know we've got a bunch of other hummingbird banders here this evening, and certainly a real cohort of owl banders, which is unfortunate, which means I can't lie to you. Usually I like talking to general audiences because I just make stuff up. But here in the East, we've got one species of breeding hummingbird on a regular basis, and that's the ruby throat. Now we think of it as an eastern hummingbird, but of course if you look at the range map, this is a bird that extends all the way up into western Alaska. And I don't think she's published this yet, but Doreen Cuby has been doing some work up in British Columbia and has extended the known range of ruby throats like another 600 miles to the northwest. It's very much a western bird. And of course in the fall, all of those ruby throats are pouring down, almost all of them, pouring down into southern Mexico and northern Central America, most of them taking, as far as we know, a trans-Gulf trip. The feeders are swarming during the the late summer and fall, and then those ruby throats are gone, and that's when my phone starts to ring. That's when Sandy Lockerman's phone starts to ring. And those of us who are working with hummingbirds, Anthony Hill up in Massachusetts, I got this hummingbird at my feeder and it forgot to migrate. Well, next to sex, the one overriding command in a bird's life is migration. Birds do not forget to migrate. And of course, you know, that's when I say I can almost guarantee you the bird at your feeder is not a ruby throat. And of course, most of those birds are rufous hummingbirds. And this has been such a cool thing to watch happen. We don't get to watch evolution in action in real time very often. But with these western hummingbirds, particularly rufous, expanding into the east and evolving a new migratory route and a new wintering area, we're watching it unfold within human lifetimes, which is just incredibly cool. You know, rufous hummingbirds, if you haven't peeked at your field guide recently, you know, their breeding range is from Northern California and Oregon up through British Columbia and into southern Alaska, actually pushing farther and farther north. They're now rare but regular as far north as Fairbanks. This is the world's most northerly hummingbird species. And in the fall, almost all of those rufous hummingbirds fly straight south, more or less straight south, into central and western Mexico. And of course, this is a genetically programmed flight. They're not learning where to fly. They're following mom and dad. I think you're all well aware of that. They come out of the egg genetically programmed to go that way. But as with anything that is genetically programmed, every once in a while you get a bird with bad software. And so instead of going that way into Oaxaca, they go that way into the Pacific Ocean and out of the gene pool, or north into the Arctic and out of the gene pool, or west, or east, I should say. And that's where it gets interesting. Back in the 1960s and 70s, people started noticing increasing numbers of rufous hummingbirds along the Gulf Coast. Most of the prominent ornithologists wrote them off as lost dead-enders. In fact, the theory for a long time was that these birds had migrated south normally and then sort of sloshed back to the north. I am unaware of a theory of migratory sloshing, but it kind of made sense. But then there were more and more of them, and they were showing up farther and farther east and farther north. And so, you know, pioneering researchers like Nancy Newfield in Baton Rouge, who was once described as a dippy little housewife. For those of you who know Nan know that's a dangerous thing. You know, she basically figured out how to band these birds and prove that they were not lost. They were not, well, they may well have been lost, but they were not dead enders. They were coming back the same yards year after year after year. And of course, over the last several decades, the numbers of these birds have expanded dramatically across the southeast and east. And you know, the banding evidence at this point is still pretty thin. But I think I feel reasonably confident that what's happening here is that these birds are moving east as part of their normal migration in late summer and early fall. Some of them, especially adult birds that have made the migration before, may be making a beeline straight back to the southeast of the Gulf region, whereas others will make this big detour to the east and up into New England and mid-Atlantic, and then as it gets colder and colder, which for a rufous hummingbird, it's got to get pretty cold to count as cold, so that by October, November, December, they're getting pushed farther and farther south, so that you know, by Christmas or New Year's, most of them are down in the Gulf region, which is their primary wintering area. They spend the winter down there. And again, the banding evidence for this is thin, but I think persuasive, that they're not going back the same way they came in the spring. They're making an east to west trip across the southern tier of states and then moving north from there. So it's this huge elliptical migration that these birds are following every year. We've got some pretty cool data points on this. You know, my favorite, I wish I'd been the person who caught this, but my good friend Fred Dietrich down in Tallahassee banded a female rufous hummingbird in Tallahassee that was recaptured 6 months later by Kate McLaughlin up in Chenega Bay, Alaska, 3,543 miles, assuming it flew straight line, which it almost certainly didn't. The longest single line distance for any hummingbird. And there have been a few other captures and recaptures that suggest that these may be birds they're primarily coming from the northern part of the breeding range. In fact, one of the things that we're doing right now is taking taking rectrices from hatching your birds and hoping to do a stable isotope study to find out where in this very linear north-south range these birds are coming from. And we've also had a bunch of recaptures over the years from birds that have been banded on wintering grounds down in the Gulf and then recaptured up in, particularly in Pennsylvania. I mean, they've been caught in a bunch of other areas, but showing the recaptures in Pennsylvania. We don't mess around with misnets when we're trying to catch hummingbirds. I mean, hummingbird banders are basically 12-year-olds that never grew up. We're using a cage trap baited with a feeder, and I'm one of the people that's trained by Bob Sargent to use the stocking method, which can cause profound embarrassment in spouses. For example, Amy and I were in a shoe outlet in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania a few years ago. You know, a hummingbird bander's always looking for like the right little head-size stocking, and there was a box of them. Perfect, like kid-sized stockings. I grabbed a handful and I marched up to the front counter and said, "Excuse me, sir, I'm a hummingbird researcher. We're using a blah, 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 blah." And the guy's like, "Yeah, sure, pal. Just take it. That's fine. Just take it." And we're walking out of the store and Amy said, "For the love of God, next time shoplift, please." This is so hard for the general public to understand. You know, the bands are just like you put on an eagle, they're just a little bit smaller. It's just, there's nothing unusual about that. And there's been a lot of talk at this meeting, and appropriately so, about stress on birds and how to minimize it. And you would think that something that weighs 2.5 or 3 grams being handled by a giant carnivorous primate would be stressed out of its brain. And yet, it is the rare hummingbird, if you've not had the opportunity to see this, it's an amazing thing to see. It's the rare hummingbird that after this whole alien abduction thing, if you give it an opportunity to drink, that it will not drink as much as you'll let it drink. And I've always said, if aliens caught me and took me up and did all the things that aliens are supposed to do, and then offered me a cheeseburger, I would deny the cheeseburger. But, you know, as we know, birds are not little people. They do not process the world in the same way that we do. We need to be careful as humans not to project too much onto them. I'm not going to, this is stuff that I would talk about with the general audience. But I will tell you that I always feel like Merlin the magician every time I slide a hummingbird onto the palm of the host, because I try to always do this, and I know Bruce and others here who are hummingbird banders do the same thing. Try to band it when the person's there, so they can have the opportunity to have that thing on their palm. And it sits there for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and then that moment when it takes off, invariably they burst into this incandescent smile. They just look like they could float away. And that's one of the coolest things that I get to do on a regular basis. They look so delicate, and yet they're not. You know, Bob Sargent used to say hummingbirds are like junkyard dogs, especially rufous hummingbirds, but they're physiologically tough as well. It's a shame that Wayne Lauscher was not here for this meeting, Dave Hoper's sub, because one of Wayne's hummingbirds holds the record among any hummingbird, so far as I know, for lowest minimum temperature survived. It was a bird that he banded in State College, Pennsylvania 3 winters ago when the polar vortex came down. The bird survived air temperatures of 9 below zero and wind chills of -36 Fahrenheit. These are tough birds, and banding is one of the ways that we know that these birds survive those kind of conditions. And what's happening with rufous hummingbirds, of course, is happening with black-chinned hummingbirds, it's happening with calliope hummingbirds, it's happening with Annas, that's the Pennsylvania's first state Annas there, with Allen's hummingbirds. There's this whole suite of western species that all of which are prone to the same hiccup in the genetic software that's sending these birds east into what centuries ago probably would have been a death sentence, but now is the land of milk and honey for it. However, trying to explain this is a little tougher. You all recognize that, I'm sure, this green violet here. Beautiful tropical hummingbird. It's actually, as currently classified, it's a single species found from Mexico to South America. Actually, the AOU just in the last couple of weeks took up a proposal to split this into, I think, 7 different species. But big, gorgeous tropical hummingbird that doesn't come any further north than southern Mexico, which is a little puzzling. And it's non-migratory as well. And so it's a little puzzling that you have this cluster of sightings and records in South Texas and Louisiana, but that's kind of close to Mexico. Missouri, Georgia, not so much. Ontario, West Virginia. Sorry to give you a flashback, Bruce. And Saskatchewan? What the hell is a tropical hummingbird doing in Saskatchewan? Well, Steve Howell has recently posed, and I think a couple of other people as well, an interesting hypothesis. Most of these green violet-ear records, as with a number of other tropical birds from Central and South and Central America and Mexico, tend to show up in late summer, and they tend to show up kind of up through the middle of North America, and that's a time when you get this Pineapple Express, these really powerful south winds blowing up from the tropics, and that may be, helping to carry these birds to the north. I want the Pineapple Express to shift a little bit to the east so that we can get them in Pennsylvania. Although we're not doing so bad in Pennsylvania. 2 springs ago, Sandy, 2 springs ago, I'm packing my bags, literally, to drive to Philadelphia to the airport, and I get an email from this Mennonite family in Lancaster County. They had a hummingbird at their feeder, and that's the picture they sent me. And I'm like, damn. I called Sandy and I said, how would you like to ban Pennsylvania's first record broad-tailed hummingbird? The gorget color's right, the vesting. She says, I'll be there in an hour. So I'm on my way to the airport, and she calls me and she says, this is not I don't know what this is, but this is not a broad-tailed hummingbird. Yeah, it was Pennsylvania's first Bahama woodstar. The first Bahama woodstar outside of South Florida, only 4 records of 5 individuals up to that point. I cannot begin to explain what this bird was doing in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. We gamed out a whole bunch of different scenarios, including ship assist, with like the nearest cruise ship from the Bahamas docks in Baltimore, which is still an awfully long way. I don't know. All I know is that I was stuck in an airport in Maine and was getting on the plane to come back home the next day with a bird left. So I never even got to see it. So I'm gonna wipe that unpleasant memory out of my brain by just shifting gears and talking about owls. I always like to start talking about saw-whet owls with this famous Ron Austin photograph, because the reaction, and those of you who've been saw-whets know this very, very well, the reaction from the general public every single time is, "Aww." And that's great if you're a human being, but if you are a deer mouse, that is demon spawn from the pit of hell. That is your worst possible nightmare. I will make a confession to you. I banned saw-whet owls today because 20 plus years ago I was trying to impress a woman. Guys, help me out. How many bad things have you done in your life where that was the reason? To be utterly honest with you. But here I am all these years later, and it worked out fine. She broke up with me and broke my heart and stomped on the ground, but I got saw-whet owls out of it. So every fall now, as these birds start moving south, this becomes the pivot point of my life, as it is for many of you. There is no better, as I think it was Ian said earlier today, the gateway drug to conservation. There's no better gateway drug to conservation in birds than saw-whet owls. They were just perfectly designed to hook people and pull them in. And they're also a species about which we knew very little. When Dave started Project Owlnet, and he was being very generous in saying that he and Steve and I started Project Owlnet. Dave started Project Owlnet. Steve and I have been along for the ride, but it was his brainchild. And it'll be 20 years this year that we started the projects in Pennsylvania, and Steve was a tremendous help with getting that started. The 3 sites that I oversee for the Ned Smith Center in central Pennsylvania, we have 18 subs working on that, well, 17 subs plus me working on that project, a total of about 100 volunteers. They put about 5,000 or 6,000 person hours a year into that, just to, really kind of a typical banding station. Virtually everybody in this room here that works at a long-term station can talk about those same kind of figures. We've banded now somewhere between 10 and 11,000 saw-whet owls. We're part of Project Alnet, which most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. Now about 125 banding stations, collaborating stations across North America. One of the things I love best about owl research in general and saw-whet owl research in particular is how cooperative and collaborative this is. Everybody kind of checks their ego at the door. It's a great model. I am not a nighttime person. I am a morning person, and this has really kind of upended my life in a lot of ways. I still can't sleep late in the morning, but now I can't go to sleep early at night. So I'm just, every year I fall farther and farther behind on my sleep. But that's okay, because this is what I get to do. I get to work with terrific people and one of the most engaging, exciting, interesting, fascinating, mysterious little birds out there. And there's that, that getting infected with acute virus moment. Steve Hoffman, many of you know Steve, founder of Hawkwatch International, one of these, quintessential raptor guys who rappels down cliffs into Golden Eagle nest. The first time he came to bed, he said, "What's that? Where's one of these little goes?" God, it's just so cute. People just go to mush when they see these things. And so, it's just, bring in as many people as possible. Just infect as many people as you possibly can. I mean, just to me, the single most important expression of why saw-whet owls were designed by evolution to be the perfect hook for bringing people in is not only are they cute, not only are they mysterious, not only are they small and approachable and not really scary, but also ferocious hunters, they glow in the dark. I mean, it's serious science and a cheap party trick all wrapped into one. You turn off the lights, you turn on that black light that's been in the back of your closet since college, and this thing's glowing in neon raspberry color. And you hear this collective gasp and the thunk of everybody's jaw hitting the ground. I will never get tired of doing that to people. And then, yes, you can talk about how owls are one of 13 orders of birds that reprocess hemoglobin in their liver and produce porphyrins, which they use to pigment their feathers, and porphyrins naturally fluorescent. People don't care. It's just like, oh my God, the owl is glowing. And they will never forget that. The owls are cyclical. Saw-whet owls are cyclical. About every 3 to 5 years, we get a big pulse of hatching year birds coming into the population. We are ready for a big year. 2012, can I say amen? Yes. Say amen. It has, the last 3 years, from a scientific perspective, in technical terms, have sucked. And I am ready. I mean, this is what a good year looks like. 2012, we were running our 3 long-term stations plus 6 experimental stations. I had 12 research technicians working for me. We caught almost 4,000 saw-whet owls that year. And the first 2 weeks of the season were really, really slow. And that was the training period for the techs. And then we sent them out the first night. It was like the first good migration night. And my cell phone just started ringing. And it's like, "Hey, Scott, this is Gunnar. I'm at Game Lines 217. We just did our first net check. We got 18 owls. And we're just, hold on a second, because somebody else is calling. Yeah, hi, this is Corinne. And I'm over at 205, and we got 21 owls on our first net check." It's like, it just never slowed down until the next year. And it's just been flatlining since then. So I think this fall is going to be another big year. The comb crops. What's that?
We have that written on the board.
I haven't made my prediction yet. Gary's job is to make sure that I always make my annual prediction at our preseason crew meeting, and then to ridicule me mercilessly. But we've also tried to use a lot of other techniques to learn more about saw-whets in addition to banding. We've learned a tremendous amount from banding with saw-whets, but from 2001 to 2009, we tagged, I forget, almost 45 saw-whet owls with standard VHF radio transmitters. We were looking at roost site selection, habitat selection. We did 2 years of nocturnal triangulation telemetry, which was the hardest thing I have ever done, and also the coldest, where teams of 3 or 4 of us were following saw-whet owls around from dusk until dawn, 7 nights a week, taking taking bearings, compass bearings on the radio signal every 10 minutes all night long. But then you start to pile that information together. What you're seeing here are each polygon of a different color represents a different night's activity for the same saw-whet owl in Michaud State Forest in southern Pennsylvania. That bird was using more than 1,700 acres over the course of about 10 days. We would never have guessed that a bird the size of a soda can, it's West Virginia pop can, would be using that kind of space. I love the fact that this is a bird typical of saw-whet owls. He's got a bag lunch. Midday roosting. He's got half a mouse down there waiting for. And I can show this to people after dinner with this group, and nobody cares. It roasts out an average audience. In 2011, we tried using a combination of forward-looking infrared videography and marine radar, vertical beam marine radar, to see if we could identify saw-whet owls in flight and then track their movements on radar. It was a beautiful idea that did not work, and it cost us about $11,000 or $12,000 to figure out it didn't work. But it was really cool. And in a couple of years, when the resolution of these video cameras gets a little bit better, we'll be able to do this again. I think we'll actually be able to make it work. We did a geolocator project in 2009 where we deployed 172 geolocators on saw-whet owls during migration, because we knew from banding studies that they showed very little, if any, site fidelity. We weren't going to be able to do what people usually do with geolocators and deploy them on the breeding grounds and wait for them to come back. So we put a lot of them out there during the migration season, and we sat back and waited based on our usual return rate to get lots of geolocators. And unfortunately, we picked a year with really bad winter weather, and the return rate for banded birds with tags and banded birds without tags both went through the floor. 172 geolocators at an expense of about $34,000, and we got one back. But the 2-year battery was still functioning after 3 years. We got 3 complete migration cycles out of this bird, and it confirmed a lot of what we had suspected about saw-whets. 0 site fidelity to breeding range. So 1 year she was breeding up in Canada, the next year she was trying to breed in Pennsylvania. That nest failed, and she flew from Pennsylvania up into the Adirondacks and re-nested in the Adirondacks. Some years she was wintering in Virginia, some years she was wintering up near the Canadian border. These birds are not like other birds. In 2012, we used the same kind of technology that Stu and the Modus project is working, using nanotags and automated receiver stations to look at local and landscape level movements in central Pennsylvania. And once Dave and I found out about Modus and what Stu and his colleagues are doing, we wanted to jump in with both feet. And so, along with Lisa and Doris McGovern and Willistown Conservation Trust, we're now trying to raise money through Project Alnet and the Ned Smith Center. If any of you have, in round figures, $500,000, and you're looking to do something with, we want to create an inland Modus network across the Northeast for the utterly selfish reason of being able to track saw-whet owl migration, but you can track, as you heard Stu earlier today say, you can track everything from monarchs and dragonflies all the way up on those things. There's a lot left to do with saw-whets. I have always said saw-whets are my favorite bird. I have always been faithful to saw-whets. And I cheated. Oh my God, what a sexy bird. So this is a typical distribution of snowy owls in a typical winter in the Northeast. This was January 2013. That was December 2013. The biggest eruption of snowy owls in the East and the Upper Midwest since at least 1926, 1927, perhaps as far back as 1896, 1897. Not coming south because they're starving, that whole malarkey about snowy owls being forced south by hunger. There was a bumper crop of lemmings in northern Quebec that year in the Ungava Peninsula. This is, you may have seen this picture, it got a lot of press. That's a snowy owl nest in Ungava that summer. 4 eggs in the middle, and feel free to count. There are 78 dead lemmings and voles around there. That translates into lots of eggs. That translates into lots of baby birds. And then in the fall, a lot, if not all, of those young snowy owls headed south in this eruption. Thanksgiving 2013, I was planning on spending a nice quiet winter finishing my then already overdue Peterson owl book. By the first week of December, this tsunami of owls had hit the Northeast. Steve had called Dave, Dave had called me, and within about a week and a half, we pulled Project Snowstorm out of our butts. There was a rather tense conversation with the team at eBird in the early weeks of December as this was all ramping up. And we'd gone, I guess this was early January, we'd actually gone live with the website. We were asking people to send us geotagged photographs of snowy owls. And our plan all along was to sort of funnel those into eBird, but we hadn't made the connection live yet. And one of the guys on this conference call from eBird, in a very testy tone of voice, said, well, perhaps next time you can bring us into the planning process a little earlier. And I said, there was no planning process. You know, I guess we pulled this out of our butts. We didn't know what we were doing. We pulled Project Snowstorm out of thin air. And it was a whole, and again, a really great example of collaborative science. You know, Dave and Steve modeling here the official Project Snowstorm chapeau, available in all fine menswear departments. Norman Smith at Mass Audubon, who's been studying snowy owls longer than anybody else. He thinks this is his 33rd year of studying snowy owls at Logan Airport. Mike Lanzone at Cellular Tracking Technology, who just happened to have the transmitters that we needed for tracking these snowy owls. J.F. Therian at Hawk Mountain, who's been doing his PhD work on snowies and continues to work up in the Arctic. We're now up to a team of about 40 people, banders, researchers, wildlife veterinarians, wildlife pathologists, all donating their time, now in our third year of doing snowy owls. And so there's a couple of elements to Project Snowstorm, and I know many of you are supporters and backers of Snowstorm, and forgive me for plowing ground you're already familiar with. The part that's generated the most attention, of course, are these GPS GSM transmitters. As of this winter, we deployed 43 transmitters on snowy owls in 10 states from North Dakota to Maine. We're also, we're banding as many snowy owls as we can, and whether we're putting tags on these birds, we're just banding them. We're also taking feather samples, we're taking blood samples where appropriate, looking at genetic makeup of snowy owl populations, looking at stable isotopes, looking at contaminants and toxicology. Snowy owls get in trouble when they come down here, so over the last 3 years, we've performed necropsies on more than 140 snowy owls that have been salvaged. This is by far the most intensive look at the health and physical condition of snowy owls. One of the things that we have found that has really surprised us is the level of mercury contamination in these birds, and I'll touch on that again in a couple of minutes. Those photographs I mentioned, this is one of the first things that Dave suggested was, why don't we just get people to send us clear, crisp photographs of snowy owls with their wings and tails open so that we can age the bird, we can see the molt limits in the wings, and especially if they're juvenile birds, you can use the barring and spotting pattern on the wing and tail feathers, especially on the secondaries, to sex them. And we were able to get this really cool age and sex distribution just using these photographs. Actually, I've just been in touch with Dan Rubenstein at Princeton, who has a new software program called IBIS that uses animal markings to recognize individuals. I mean, they're using photographs of elephants that use the wrinkle pattern above the eyes of the elephant to identify individuals. Zebras, and he thinks actually that the spotting pattern on the wings of snowy owls may be individually recognizable across a single season. So we may be able to take all of the photographs in eBird and run them through this program and actually track the movements of individual birds just from their photographs, which is really cool. There are many, many people involved in Project Snowstorm. I'll give you 15 minutes to study that. This is just to show you that there are a lot of people, all of them giving fully and completely of their time for this project. The one thing we did not have, of course, was a budget, because budgets require planning, and as I said, there was no planning. So we had some very generous private donors initially who gave us seed money to get the first couple of transmitters out there, and then we launched an Indiegogo campaign online, crowdfunding, I thought this idea was dumber than a bag of hammers, to be honest. Who is going to give? We're going to ask for $20,000 online from strangers. They gave us $36,000. I still find that staggering. And then ornithological organizations and private donors gave us an almost equal amount that first year. We just wrapped up our third Indiegogo campaign. People are incredibly energized by snowy owls. I mean, they're big, they're sexy, they're charismatic. Harry Potter doesn't hurt. But we've created a community now of people who are interested in snowy owl research and are willing to support that, which is just incredibly humbling. Of course, if you're gonna tag a snowy owl, you first have to catch a snowy owl. Lots of ways you can do that. You can use balsam trees, you can use fire traps. Bow nets are probably the most efficient way of doing it. I want to show you why snowy owls are not like other owls. This is it's slowed down to half speed. This is a GoPro at the corner of the bow net. There's a snowy owl. Whoa. One pass. Second pass. By the way, the fish will be okay at the end of this. He's lost a second here, but not that it's the high point of his day. Snowy owls are like white falcons. They would really prefer to take their prey in the air. They're incredibly agile, incredibly aggressive, fast flyers. And this is really typical of a snowy owl attack. Streaking attacks. These are not pound snipers. Now, not every snowy owl acts that way. Not every snowy owl is quite that aggressive. Every snowy owl makes up his mind very quickly. You might want to go get some coffee. No, actually, the owl I caught at the same site before this landed 100 yards away and walked. No. Yeah, no. Closer. Okay. It was 7 degrees with a 20-mile-an-hour wind that night. I was really anxious to catch that out. Once you got the bird, of course, I mean, they are massively powerful birds. They're actually not terribly aggressive most of the time once you have them in the hand. They're pretty docile. They are literally lousy birds. They are lousy birds. This is typical of snowy owls. You can see all the malacca, all the feather lice on there. I don't know if it's because they are they're white and so the lice are more visible, or if because there's very little melanin in the feathers, there's less protection to protect them against chewing lice, but they are just covered with lice. And in fact, Jason Weckstein at the Academy of Natural Sciences, who studies bird parasites, has promised to teach me how to quantitatively ruffle a snowy owl to sample its lice. I have no idea how you quantitatively ruffle a bird, but it is now my favorite ornithological phrase. So the transmitters we're using are 40 to 50 gram GPS GSM transmitters. They're continually recording highly precise GPS locations from the GPS transmitter or the GPS satellites overhead, and then once a week they dial up. We have a program for once a week usually. They dial up through the GSM cell phone network and basically send us a text message with all of the data. So, I mean, two technologies that almost all of you are carrying around in your pocket right now. They're solar powered, they can last for years, and the quality and quantity of data that we're getting from these are just incredible. And I think it's fair to say that, I think Dave and Steve would agree with me. Virtually every bird we put a transmitter on has surprised us in some way. Starting with the very first one, who was wintering on the coast of Maryland and New Jersey and did virtually no hunting over land, did all of his hunting at night out over open water, feeding on water birds. We think of snowy owls as lemming specialists, and some of them are, they all are during the summer, but in the winter they're feeding on ducks, they're feeding on gulls, they're feeding on rabbits, they're feeding on skunks, they're feeding on muskrats, they're feeding on anything they can get. They're going in directions we don't expect. You tag a bird in December in Maryland, you figure, oh, he's still on his way south. The bird turns north and goes up into the coast of New Jersey to spend the winter. Some of them wandered hundreds of miles over the course of a single winter. Others barely budged. These are two birds we tagged last winter on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Chippewa and Whitefish Point were their nicknames. And we're talking here about maybe a quarter of a mile. And these birds were the two adult females, the definition, or the embodiment of that old Robert Frost line that good fences make good neighbors. They never trespassed. In fact, this bird only flew through that bird's territory after that bird had gone north for the winter, or for the summer. But you know, if your neighbor weighs 6 pounds and has 8 razor-sharp knives at the end of her feet, maybe you don't trespass. Surprises again. So this was a bird that was wintering on Barnegat Bay in New Jersey that first winter. And in this map style, anything in blue is nighttime and anything in red is daytime. And you can see, first of all, despite what we've been told for years and years and years, snowy owls are not diurnal. In the daytime, if they're not being disturbed by birders and photographers, they mostly just sit around waiting for it to get dark. And then at night, they do most of their hunting. Yes, they're diurnal during the summertime in the Arctic because otherwise they would starve. But if it gets dark, they prefer to hunt at night. But one thing that was surprising to me, though, when we first looked at this data was, I mean, these are little islands where the bird was sitting in the daytime, but there's this big round dot up in the middle, out in the middle of the water. Now, later in the winter, that all froze, but this was still open water at this time of the year. So you zoom in on Google Earth, you zoom in a little closer, and you can just barely see under there, there's a channel marker. He was flying out and landing on this buoy and going, like Brant tonight? Or will it be Scout? Brant, Scout. And this one, so when the raw data comes in a KML file in Google Earth, we're getting data on this bird every 30 minutes. So each of these icons represents a 30-minute interval. Square icons are a stationary location, and little triangles like that are a moving location. And I looked at this out on Lake Erie, and I thought, oh my God, he's walking to Canada. Because this is like not quite half a mile an hour. It took a little while before the penny dropped, and we realized, no, that's what happens when you have a stationary owl sitting on ice floes that are being pushed to the northeast by a southwest wind. And that was one of the other real revelations from this, how much these snowy owls love ice. And it's really cool to see the movements of these juvenile owls that in some cases, spent weeks and weeks at a time out on the ice of the Great Lakes in Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, miles from land, never coming near land, and presumably hunting water birds in the cracks and openings in the ice out there. For example, there was a 3 winters ago now, there was a persistent open area off Long Point, and we had several snowy owls that were hunting there, probably looking for water birds out in that area. In fact, you can see up in the right up in there what they were doing. They loved ice. So you have some snowy owls that are as far away from people as possible, and then you have other snowy owls like this one that move into the heart, the urban heart of Baltimore. And with this bird, because these GPS transmitters can be reprogrammed on the fly, we can send it a message that says, instead of taking data every 30 minutes, take it every 30 seconds, which we did with this bird. And then you could go into Google Street View and see it from the bird's perspective. Now, because we were collecting data so frequently, the GPS locations are not as precise as would usually be the case. So it's not like she was bouncing all over the air over this church. She was roosting on the top of that church. This is one of the coolest birds that we worked with. This is a bird that in help me out here, Steve, if I get any of these dates wrong. February 2014, originally caught at Martin State Airport in Baltimore. And
March 14, and then
March 14th, okay. And then you moved it out to, we couldn't tag it because we didn't have a small enough transmitter. This is a fairly small male. But Steve banded him, took him out to Western Maryland, released him. Last winter, he shows up back at the same small state airport outside of Baltimore. Gets trapped again. Dave and Steve put a transmitter on him, move him to the coast, and release him. And in April last year, he starts moving north. We actually spent most of the winter on the New Jersey coast. Starts moving north, actually goes through New York City. And I mean through New York City, right up through the middle of Manhattan, stopped at 2 o'clock in the morning on top of a 58-story skyscraper next to, this is Madison Square Garden right here. That's the view he had. Did not like it, kept moving. And then eventually all the way up into northern Ungava, and then this winter came back again and spent the whole winter on Amherst Island in Lake Ontario. And so we've got 14,000 incredibly precise GPS locations for this bird. It's easily the most detailed record of the movement of any snowy owl ever. This is what it looked like from about 36,000 feet in northern Ungava. One thing we know for sure is that this bird was not nesting this summer. We know how old he is because he was down here as an HYSY the first winter. We don't know how old snowy owls are when they start to nest. And so with these tagged, known age birds, if he comes back again next winter and downloads all of his backlog data and he's in one spot, well, we'll know that snowy owls, at least some snowy owls, start breeding in their 4th calendar year. So we're really hoping this guy comes back. But you know, they don't all make it. You know, life is dangerous for any wild bird. You guys know that more than anybody. This is a bird that Norman Smith caught up at Logan and tagged and transported down to Cape Cod, released it. It was a female named Sandy Neck. She flew out to Martha's Vineyard and spent the winter, this is 2 years ago, spent the winter on Martha's Vineyard. And in late March of that year, a huge nor'easter came up along the coast with 70, 80 mile an hour hurricane force winds and enormous waves. And she drowned. She tried to fly across the open bay. We don't know if a wave caught her or she got pushed down by wind, but she and another one of our tagged birds also drowned in that same storm. And we know of at least 4 other untagged snowy owls that were found washed up dead and drowned in the wake of that storm as well. These were young birds. I suspect an older bird might have not have made that bad a decision, but you know, but bad things happen to snowy owls. Most of the bad things that happen to them have to do with us, and a lot of that happens at airports. Snowy owls are attracted to airports. They're wide open. They kind of, it's often the only thing that looks even remotely like home in a forested, mountainous, developed area. They're looking for wide open spaces. They're looking for open horizons. And if you're a snowy owl in a place like Philadelphia or Boston, the only place that looks like that is liable to be an airport. The first snowy owl I put a transmitter on was a juvenile male that I caught at the Philadelphia airport. This is Jenny Martin from, at the time she worked for USDA APHIS. She was a tremendous help working at Philadelphia Airport. We put a tag on the bird, moved 50 miles west into the open farmland of Lancaster County where there were lots of other snowy owls, and the son of a bee flew right back to the airport. And we spent the next 3 weeks trying to trap him and move him. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, right at daybreak one day, he flew across that runway just as a cargo jet was taking off, and the impact broke every major bone of that bird's body. The point of impact was the transmitter, which still worked afterwards. Not very well, but it was still functioning. Bad for us, bad for the bird, but at least it didn't come through the cockpit window at 600 miles an hour. That will just ruin your day if you're a pilot or a passenger. So this is a serious problem. We've been working with Wildlife Services to try to get a better handle on what procedures work best for moving snowy owls so they stay moved. I mentioned earlier that we're also doing a lot of lab and toxicology work. We're necropsying these birds, whether they've been struck by planes at airports or just picked up in the birds have been electrocuted, just found dead. We're finding out that most of these birds are in really good shape when they die. Most of them that die of accidents. This myth that the starving snowy owl really is, by and large, just a myth. We expected to see a real problem with anticoagulant rodenticides because we know that that's an increasing problem with raptors in general. We've been pleasantly surprised to see much less of that than we expected. What we weren't expecting was to see the incredibly high mercury levels that we're seeing in many of these birds. But it makes sense. If these birds are feeding on water birds to the extent that many of them are, mercury is, it bioaccumulates through the food chain, just like DDT used to do, still does. And so particularly if you're feeding on water birds from freshwater environments, they can get really heavy mercury load. So Dave and I just had a conference call with the folks at BRI who are world leaders in working on mercury contamination. This is something that we're going to be looking at really hard, looking at our movement data to see if we can tease out the difference in mercury levels between birds that are in coastal environments versus inland environments, or birds in coastal environments where some of them are feeding on water birds and some of them, based on their movement patterns, are feeding on terrestrial mammals. Right around this time of the year, the birds start moving north in late March and early April. With the older birds that we've tagged the last couple of winters, we're seeing them depart earlier than the juveniles, which makes sense. They need to get back up north. They don't have to go very far to get beyond the cell phone network. This is what it looks like in southern Canada. You know, once the birds, you know, just a couple of 100 kilometers north of the Canadian border, they're out of cell phone range. But the transmitters continually record and log GPS locations. At 30-minute intervals, they can store more than 10 years worth of data. And when those birds come back south again, they download that data. These are the tracks north and back south again for about half a dozen of our owls over the last couple of years, going up into northern Nunavut and northern Nunavut. It's been interesting. None of our owls, and actually none of the satellite tagged owls that Norman has worked with in Logan over the last few years, have gone all the way to the high Canadian Arctic in places like Baffin Island and Biela. I think maybe Norman's had one bird that's gone up there. These birds seem to be, I hate to talk about regional populations because we think snowy owls are even more nomadic than saw-whets, but I find it an interesting pattern that they're just not going that far north. And I want to leave you with one last little surprise that I just find whimsical and what makes this so much fun. This is a bird that we tagged 3 winters ago on Lake Erie. In his first summer, he went north and up into Hudson Bay, and out actually into Hudson Bay. And then you look at this. How many of you had a spirograph when you were a kid? It looks like he's playing with a spirograph. And you know, you look at that for a long time before you finally go, oh, this is what it looks like when a snowy owl is riding on an iceberg. And when the tide and the wind are going in the same direction, the iceberg goes a long distance, and then when the tide shifts and comes back against the wind, it doesn't go so far, and then the tide shifts again and it goes with the wind, and then the wind shifts out of the south, and then the wind shifts out of the west, and then the bird gets bored finally after a couple of days and flies back to land. This is just so cool. You know, yes, I cheated on saw-whet owls, and I'm not proud of it, and I'm awfully glad that I did. Folks, it is a pleasure and a privilege to stand before you. It is a delight to be back, kind of in the fold of EVA, and if you want to keep me away, like I said again, for a while, change the rules. Thank you all very much. Dave, I know we have the bucket raffle and everything else. Can I suggest that perhaps if people have questions, they can afterwards, we don't delay this anymore? Okay. Thank you all very much.